Yeah, but you have to like pay for it.
Alrighty, let's get started.
Yeah.
This is our first lecture in the month of April. And we only have 9 lectures left, including this one.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
Right here. Right here. Just so you are aware, not this Friday, but next Friday. So next Friday would be April 14th. I will most likely pre-record my lecture for obvious reasons because we are hosting our canoe and bridge. And so I know that we'll probably have a lot of folks busy with that. And so in the interest of that, I will probably just pre-record. We've got some traces of our previous lecture.
He was tearing it up today.
What's that?
He was tearing it up today.
Well, what I told him is I said, one day what's going to happen is I'm going to take the expo marker and I'm going to write on this screen. And I'm going to say, how come you all can't see it? You know, and then I'll know it's probably...
See, I couldn't see what he was writing today, though. He was just... It was like a faded marker, and it was inside of a diagram that was already on the screen, and it was just disastrous. Yeah, it was...
Well, what I just took off the screen was red, so...
Oh, he had like... There was red inside the red, blue inside the blue.
It's okay. I mess with him, but he is definitely a good sport with that. Okay. Today what we're going to do is, last time we discussed the analysis of continuously braced beams, and now what we're going to do is discuss the design of continuously braced beams. Before I do that though, and I was going to get to this during the lecture today, but it's sort of on my mind now, and I thought it was good to go ahead and bring this up now, and that was... there was a question that got brought up near the end of lecture, and I thought it was really pertinent to go ahead and explain this. One of the questions I got about what was related to deflection limits, and the question was, why are there only live load deflection limits? Why aren't there any deflection limits associated with dead loads? And that was a really good question, and the best way to explain that is I kind of want to I'm just using this diagram on the board for the purposes of discussion. It doesn't really matter all that much, which is why I'm not putting it on the screen. But let's just say for the sake of discussion, I have a beam and it's got load on it, and the load consists of both dead load and live load. And just for the sake of discussion, let's say that the deflection due to the dead load was 1 inch and the deflection due to the live load was 2 inches. It doesn't really matter, but just for the sake of discussion. Okay. So the question was, why don't we ever really consider deflection limits associated with dead loads? The answer is because of a process called cambering. C-A-M-B-E-R, cambering. And what that basically means is this. So if I have a beam in this building, so let's say there's beams up here that's supporting the weight of the floor system above us. Okay, I could very easily compute the dead load deflection and the live load deflection separately. And let's say I have a dead load deflection of 1 inches. What I can then do is go to the fabricator and ask the fabricator to physically and permanently bend the beam upwards a total of 1 inch, or curve it so that the deflection, or the upward deflection in the middle, is 1 inch. And so when the beam is brought to the site, it actually has an upward curve to it with an upward deflection of 1 inch at midspan. Then the beam gets, connected to the adjacent elements. We put the SIP formwork down, we pour the slab, and now we apply that dead load, and the beam deflects 1 inch. So the net deflection is 0, right? So we can get around dead load deflection through the process of cambering. Live load deflection, we really can't get around, because in order to do that, if we wanted to get around dead load and live load deflection, we'd have to bend the beam upwards a total of what, 3 inches, right? Then what would happen is we would all walk into this room and the floor beams would be like this. And the only way to sit them flat is if we put the maximum number of people in the room so that it would sit flat. And That's not going to happen, right? So what we can do is we can get around dead load deflection with camber, but not really live load deflection, which is why a lot of our deflection limits are live load deflection limits and not dead load deflection limits. Does that make sense?
Kind of like how a truck bed is, like they'll have halfway curve, you put a big load on it.
Yes.
We don't want that to happen.
Yeah, so like, you're exactly right. So on a flatbed truck, if you ever see an unloaded flatbed, like it's kind of got an upward curve to it, so that when you put the load on it, it sits flat and you don't start buckling down. That's exactly right. So, but the thing is, we don't care for a flatbed if the floor is like that. But I don't think anybody in here would appreciate it if they walked into a classroom and the floor was like that, right? So it's fine if you're placing the concrete deck, but not if we're in here teaching. I don't want to have to walk up and down hills every time I'm pacing around the classroom. So but I mean I know it's kind of funny, but that's really sort of the main motivation of why we consider only live loads for deflection limits. Does that make sense?
Well, wouldn't you have to still design, or figure out what dead load deflection was to then tell the manufacturer how to?
Yes, that is 100% right. Yes, you do. And so whenever you're looking at composite beam design, you are 100% right. What you would do is you select your element, and then you do a separate calculation for dead load deflection, and then you send that out. So if you ever look at a framing plan, like an actual framing plan for a let's say, here's column, 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 and then we have element, 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 element. And then we look at this, right? If we're looking at this element, what it'll say is it'll say something like W24 by 76. And if you actually look at the plans for the building, it'll say something like C equals 1 inch camber, and then it'll say something like 22. And the 22 is the number of studs that go on top of the beam. So that's very common in structural framing plans, that it'll call it out like that. It'll say 24 by 76, what the camber is and what the number of studs are. So yes, you do have to compute it in order to tell them. But if you can do live load deflection calculations, you can do dead load. It's just a different number. So.
Do you adjust for the length too? But it's gonna, because if something deflects, doesn't it draw from?
I get what you're saying, but the short, no. So, because really the main mode of deformation is going to be just pure flexure of the beam. So that doesn't mean you don't get other sources of deflection, but they're not as pronounced. So it's good stuff. I like this. Any questions? All right. So first off, just want to make sure that everybody is comfortable with negotiating table 3.2. We are going to use this quite a bit. Remember, for a continuously braced beam, the nominal moment capacity is MP or FYZX. And again, like I said, table 3.2 has a lot of stuff in it. We are going to know what all that stuff is by the time the semester is over. But for now, we're only looking at a small portion of it. Remember that the sections are listed in groups, and that every group, the top row is bolded. And if you look at a given group, so for example, if we look here at the screen, let's look at this top group. So we have a 24 by 62, 16 by 77, 12 by 96, 10 by 112, 18 by 71. Of these 5 sections, the top one is the lightest. The 62 pounds per foot is lighter than all the others, but it also has the higher ZX of all these groups. So it is the most efficient from a bending standpoint. In fact, we have a name for those. We call those the economy sections. So if you ever hear me refer to economy shapes or economy sections, I'm referring to the bold rows in table 3.2 because those are the most efficient from a ZX standpoint. Now, I'm going to throw another one at you, and this is table 3.3. So if you look at table 3.3, it's obviously right behind table 3.2, but if table 3.2 organizes by ZX, table 3.3 organizes by IX. Okay, it's a much shorter table, and there's really nothing in it but the moments of inertia. But the idea is that this is the table that you would utilize to select the section based on deflection requirements. So if you remember the last problem that we did in class, you found that the example problem that we did, it met moment requirements, it met shear requirements, and it met deflection requirements, but the deflection requirements were the ones that were the most important. That was the one that had the highest performance ratio. So it is possible that we go through the design process, we select an element or select a beam based on its moment capacity, but then we find it doesn't meet the deflection requirements. And so if a section doesn't meet the deflection requirements, we select based off this table. And notice the similar grouping, how we have sections that are grouped in groups and then the top row is bolded. It's because that's the one that has the largest moment of inertia within that group that is also the lightest, okay? So the idea is that we're sort of selecting based off two criteria. And so let's actually go through the process. This process is a little bit more involved, I guess you would say, than column selection, but you'll sort of see what I mean here, okay? So first off, let's go through the process as to how we would design a continuously braced beam, okay? So the first thing that we have to do is we have to compute the factored moment, okay? But with beam design, we got ourselves a little bit of a pickle. We got a problem, okay? One load that all beams must be able to withstand are their own self-weight. The problem is that if you're in design mode, you do not know what the self-weight of the beam is because you haven't picked a beam, right? So that means you have to guess something, okay? Now, common assumptions for the self-weight of an individual steel beam are something like 50 pounds per foot to 100 pounds per foot. And the only thing I can tell you is that you get better at this with experience. The more beams that you design, you can sort of take a look at the spans, take a look at the loads, and see what value makes sense. To be clear, on homework problems, I'll tell you what the assumption needs to be. I'm not going to make it that vague. But in the real world, you're not told, okay? So you need to assume something. Now, this gray box here, I kind of want to get a little bit on my soapbox here and talk about this. There are some engineers out there that will not assume a self-weight during the design phase at all. I personally don't recommend doing that for two reasons. Number one, you're going to have to account for the self-weight anyways during the analysis phase. So the idea is that you do during the design phase, you do some calculations to select a shape. Then once you pick that shape, you have to analyze it. If you don't assume a self-weight, you're going to have to account for it during the design phase. Now, I will level with you that steel beams generally are lighter than their concrete alternative. So there's a chance that your self-weight really won't affect your final design too much. However, if you ignore the self-weight during the initial steps, there's a better chance or a higher risk that you are going to have to iterate your design more times than necessary. So I think picking a value at the very beginning of the problem reduces the amount of iteration that you have to do later. Okay? All right. So first step is to compute your factored moment. The second step is to compute the required moment of inertia based on your deflection limits. Okay? Make sure that you're careful with your units. Don't forget your 1728 unit conversion factor. And so when it's all said and done after step 2, you should have two values for design. You should have a factored moment, which may or may not need to be updated later. And then you have a required moment of inertia. So that's what you should leave steps 1 and 2 with. Okay? Everybody with me on that? All right. Next thing to do is to select an economical shape. So what that means is we're going to go to table 3.2 and we're going to pick a shape. Okay? Now, if table 3.2 selects shapes or organizes shapes based on ZX, because table 3.2 computes the phi and p's as well, we can actually just look at the phi and p's directly with the understanding that phi and p is only going to match an FY of 50 KSI. If for some reason we're dealing with a steel grade that is not 50 KSI, what I can do is take that MU from step 1, divide it by 0.9 FY, and actually look up a section based on ZX. We're not going to worry about that during the initial stages of the course, because if you have an FY that's not 50 KSI, you're going to have to manually compute the shear capacity, and we're not going to cover that till near the end anyways. So for now, I'll tell you that for now, every beam design problem is going to be a 50 KSI part, so you can sort of ignore this part for right now. So what we'll do is we'll go in and we will select a section based off of phi and p. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at that section and we're going to see, does that section have an adequate moment of inertia? And if the answer is no, we are then going to need to select the most economical selection based on IX and then move on to the next stage of the problem. Now you can skip this if for your trial section the moment of inertia is bigger than what's needed, but if it's smaller than what's needed, you're going to have to update your trial selection. Once we get a trial shape, we're going to need to analyze that section to verify its capacity. And what I mean by that is moment, shear, and deflection, but really that's only necessary if the beam is heavier than what you assume, okay? So if you assume the beam weighs 50 pounds per foot and you pick something like a W30 by 118, well that beam's heavier, that means the moments are higher than what you assess. Deflection limits, checking deflection limits really isn't all that necessary, but it's probably a good idea just to make sure you didn't mess anything up with hitting buttons in your calculator. And shear capacity, again, as I mentioned earlier, shear capacity for most routine beams in building design, shear really isn't all that much of a problem. Was shear a big deal on the homework assignment that y'all just did? I imagine the performance ratio was pretty low for the shear on homework 6.2, am I right? Okay. Now, the one thing I'll mention on this slide is that for moment capacity, the evaluation is theoretically easy. We take the moment capacity, we compare it against the applied loads. For shear, take the shear capacity, compare it against the applied loads. But what about deflections? Deflections, what we're doing is we're comparing the maximum live load deflection against some limiting value. And the thing about deflections in the steel manual is there really is no limit. Let me qualify that statement. If you open up your steel manual and you go to the various chapters in the manual, so chapter D is the chapter on tension members, chapter E is the chapter on compression members. We're actually in chapter F right now, which is on beams. We haven't really delved into chapter F yet because we're going to talk about that a little later when we get to buckling. Chapter J on connections. Chapter L is the chapter on serviceability, and there are different sections related to serviceability. Section L2 is deflections. This is what the manual says. Deflections in structural members and structural systems shall be limited so as to not impair the serviceability of the structure. That's it. That is all the steel manual says about limiting deflections. That's it. What does that mean? That's a good question, okay? The fact is, the steel manual does not codify deflection limits explicitly. And I'll tell you that other specifications do. A good example of that is in the concrete design spec. If you open up ACI 318, for those of you that have had concrete design, you know what I'm talking about. When you assess deflections, you explicitly already know, is this element subjected to damage? Is it not subjected to damage? Limit is L over 180 or L over 360. It's very easy to ascertain what your maximum allowable deflection is. Bless you. But in steel design, there's nothing there. Okay? Now, one thing I will say is that now let me qualify this. I don't think the steel manual needs to contain literally everything. Because if it did, the steel manual would be absolutely huge. I mean, I'm sure some of you think it's huge now. There's still a lot of stuff that isn't explicitly covered in here. But that's where some of these design guides come into play. So if you all have a student membership account with AISC, which just about everybody in here should, because you needed that to purchase the manual, as students, you have access to these design guides for free. And in terms of money, if you were to have to buy these design guides, you'd be spending thousands of dollars. So this is a really cool resource. If you haven't already taken advantage of downloading these, I would. Okay? And there's a lot of really cool stuff on there about staggered truss systems, and about columns that are encased in concrete, and torsion, and a lot of really, really cool stuff. Like they just released a new one on speed core systems, which is really cool. Design Guide 3 is the one related to design serviceability design considerations. And so if you look at your finish type, dependent upon what type of ceiling you have, what type of element that you're looking at, you can look up your deflection limits pretty easily. Like for example, plastered ceilings, recommendation is an L over 360 deflection limit, as I mentioned earlier. So you can find these deflection limits pretty easily. But one of the reasons that they aren't codified in the manual is that the steel industry's, I guess, take on this is they want to allow the flexibility for clients to specify deflection limits themselves. And I get that. Honestly, I kind of wish that there were just some limits in the manual to go off of, but I'm probably not going to win that argument anytime soon. What that means for the purposes of this class is that whenever we're looking at a problem, I'm just going to give you the deflection limits for the problem, much like a client would have to, because that's kind of how it is in the real world. So with that, this is going to be the problem that we look at today. So let me pull up the notebook. So we are going to design this beam. Let me get a little smaller. So we're going to design a continuously braced beam to withstand the following loads. So we've got a dead load of 1.2 kips per foot, and now we have a live load applied at mid-span. Okay. Now this dead load, this 1.2 kips per foot, this does not include the self-weight of the beam. So to be clear, there might be some problems later on this semester where I say, whatever dead load is given, just assume that that incorporates the self-weight of the beam, and if that's the case, you don't really need to go back and iterate things. However, for now, we are going to need to go back and iterate the self-weight of the beam because, or iterate our analysis, because we're not going to know whether or not this is going to be sufficient until we start getting into the math. You'll see what I mean here in a little bit. So we have a distributed load of 1.2 kips per foot. We have a live load of 40 kips applied at midspan. What you do not do is take that 40 kips and divide it by 35 and just spread it out over the beam and use WL squared over 8. You do not do that, because what that means is that you are spreading load out, I would say, inappropriately. In reality, that beam is seeing 40,000 pounds right in the middle. And if you spread it out, the moments are not going to accurately reflect that. We're going to design a beam to withstand all this. We're going to ensure that the beam meets a live load deflection limit of L over 600. So for this structure, I'm really tightly controlling my deflection limits. Okay. All right, so okay. So step one, what we're going to need to do is determine MU. And I'll put, and also VU. Now to be clear, as I've said, shear doesn't really, bless you, doesn't really greatly impact steel beam selection and routine building design, but if we're doing analysis, we might as well go ahead and get some of these values. Okay, so let's start off with the let's start off by listing some parameters here. Okay, so we know that the length of the beam is 35 feet. We know that the dead load is 1.2 kips per foot. We know that the self-weight of the beam, and I use W naught for that, is 50 pounds per foot or 0.05 kips per foot. And I'm going to put a big assumed on that, because that is an assumed self-weight, and I know that the live load is 35 kips. Okay? Okay. So let's handle that one step at a time. Let's start off with the dead load. So for the dead load, what I've got is I've got a beam that is simply supported, okay, and I've got that, and ultimately what I'm considering is W net or W dead plus W naught, which is going to be 1.25 kips per foot. Now again, right now I'm using 50 pounds per foot because I have no idea what the beam's going to look like. Okay. Later on, we will need to update this value based on whatever beam we select. Okay. This is 35 feet. So, how do we compute the maximum shear? How do we compute the maximum moment? Let's start off with moment. That one's probably one you're a little bit more familiar with. If I have a simply supported beam subjected to a uniformly distributed load, what is the maximum moment at midspan? WL squared over 8. In this case, the W is WD plus W naught L squared over 8, which is 1.25 kips per foot, 35 feet squared over 8. And what is that? Has everybody brought their Casio FX 115 ES Plus or similar scientific calculator? And we had class, and I said, I'm going to rely on you, Mr. Ashworth, and then, do you have your Casio FX 115 ES Plus or similar scientific calculator?
191.4. 191.4.
And it's now been seconded. Okay. I think you earned this. Get ready?
Ooh.
Take your belt.
Mr. Langenfelter, I need your help on this next one.
Give me my calculator back.
So this one's going to be WD plus W naught L over 2, so 1.25 times 35 feet over 2. What do we got for this?
21.875.
So we'll call it 21.88, because keep in mind, this is all based on an estimated self-weight. So I'm not saying we can be super loose with our calculations, but we're probably going to have to update this anyways. So now that's the dead load assessment. What about the live load assessment? So let's look at the live load. So live load, what we've got we have this. Okay, so live load. Oh wait, no, that's not what we have. Here I am saying don't do this, and that's exactly what I did.
Wow. Well, we're relying on you for this one now, after that.
Mr. Lingenfelter, what's that live load plasma midspan? I'm relying on you.
40 kip.
40 kips. What am I going to do? All right, this is 35 feet. And what we know about this problem is that this is set at midspan. So this is 17.5 feet. So what we need is VL ML. Okay, so for the live load shear, what is that going to be? Do you really need a formula for that?
No.
20.
It's going to be what?
20.
20. Yeah, it's going to be half that, right? So it's going to be PL over 2. Right? Because our shear diagram is just going to be, up, over, down, over, up. 20, negative 20. Right? And so our moment is going to be PL over 4. And just so y'all are aware, again, this is coming from basic structural analysis, right? So here's the beam, that's P, this distance here is L over 2, right? So when we look at our shear diagram, we go up P over 2, over, down, over, up. So this is P over 2, this is negative P over 2. And what's the area? It's P over 2 times L over 2 plus PL over 4 minus PL over 4. So that's all that is. So just regular old structural analysis. So this is 40 kips times 35 feet over 4. And what is that? 350?
Yep.
350 foot kips. And so now all we got to do is we got to say VU is 1.2 V dead plus 1.6 V live. And then and I think I can go ahead and give you some of these. So VU, I got VU as 58.25 kips. Does that sound right? I'm hoping.
Yeah.
MU
58.26.
Hold on. We'll do the 26. Remember, for shear, it's not going to matter. And this one, I've got 789.7. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, so ultimately the magical value that we wanted at the end of this step was our factored moment, but we went ahead and got the shear. And again, like we've seen so far, the shear really isn't going to matter all that much anyways. Okay, now step 2, we need to compute our required moment of inertia. Okay, so the way this is going to work is, first off, help me out. What is our center line deflection, our center line live load deflection expression that we're going to use? If we have a simply supported beam with a point load at midspan, what's our maximum deflection that we need to consider for design? And if you want, we can call this, tell you what, we'll call this delta L max, and we'll have this delta L limit. So we know our limit is L over 600, that was given, that's what we need to be designing for. But how do we compute that deflection? Well, I mean, one way is we could break out the method of virtual work, remember the little m, big M over EI, integrate, remember all that stuff we did last semester? Or we can look it up. What is the maximum deflection due to a point load midspan?
PL cubed over 48 PI.
PL cubed right? Okay. So this is our maximum deflection that we'll actually get from the loads, and this is our limit, okay? So the limit, I think we can go ahead and do that one now. The limit's pretty easy. Should we do the limit as x approaches infinity of? It's just that's a joke. Like, some of you are like, we graduate in like 3 weeks. Like, this isn't funny anymore. Okay, so this is 35 feet over 600, and then this is 12 inches per foot. And so, what is that?
0.7.
0.7 inches. Got a second?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll say 0.70 inches. Okay, and now our maximum deflection is PL cubed over 48 EI. Now, let me show you what I'm going to do, okay, so everybody follow along with me, all right? So, what we've got is we've got 40 kips times 35 feet cubed over 48. I did it again. 48 times 29,000 KSI times IX, okay? I don't know what IX is yet because I haven't figured that out. But am I missing something? What goes right here? Or 1728. So if my max has to be less than or equal to this, all I have to do is set this expression equal to 0.7 and just solve for the moment of inertia, right? So what I'm ultimately doing is I'm saying this, so watch this. So I'm saying that delta L max has to be less than or equal to delta L limit. So 0.70 inches has to be less than or equal to all of this. Okay? So the way I'm going to handle this, here's how I'm going to handle this. All right? I'm going to take the IX, move it over here, the 0.7, move it over here. So I'm basically saying IX has to be greater than or equal to all of that. So instead, why don't I just write this by saying IX required has to equal and I get this, what is IX required? So do y'all see what I did there? I just said IX moves over here, 0.7 moves down there, so IX needs to be greater than or equal to this fraction, or IX needs to be at least whatever that fraction is. So what do we get for IX required?
$2979.4.
2979.4. Mine came out a little bigger. A little bit.
3041.38.
That's what I got. Do I have a second on that?
Yeah.
Okay. That's inches to the fourth. Okay, I want to stop for a sec. We'll take us. I don't want to go just barrel through this. Does that make sense? I got 40, 35 cubed, 1728, and on the bottom, 48, 29,000.7.
Oh, 49.
That'll do. All right, is everybody okay with this? Okay, now I want everybody to pay attention, okay? So ultimately, we've got two values, okay? Let me just write this up here. Let's just use this as a reference. So we've got an MU value, maybe we'll call it MU design, of 789.7 foot kips. And we have an IX required of 3041.4 inches to the fourth. Okay. So step 3, here's what I want to do. Select a section based on MU. Okay. And what I'm going to say is for a continuously braced beam, phi mn is phi mpx. And that is not going to be the case. That is not going to be the case later on. So, here's what I want to do. I want to go to table 3.2. Okay? The ZX charts. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the phi MP column. Okay? And so what we're going to do is, remember, these are the flexural capacities of the section based on continuously braced assumption, which is what is the case for this problem. So remember how they're grouped. Remember how they're grouped according to their ZX, or ultimately their phi and P. So I want you to find the lightest section that has a flexural capacity of 789.7 or more. But what that means is we're looking for the bold row in that group.
W24 by 84.
Okay, a W24, so let's try this. Let's put this right here. So try a W24 by 84. Okay, now, before we go any further, Mr. Page, tell me this. You selected that because it has a phi mpx of what?
840.
840 foot kips. Now I don't want to look at anything else. First thing I want to do is I want to make sure that everybody's able to find that. Is everybody able to find that? Everybody good? Okay. Now, before we go any further, can anybody tell me anything about this number, the 84? And what can you tell me about that?
That's greater than what we assumed.
Exactly. So if we were to select this section, we need to go back and update all those moments and shears that we computed earlier. It's not going to greatly affect things, but it's enough that those initial moments and shears are wrong. Okay? But now here's the next thing I want you to tell me. For a W24 by 84, what is the moment of inertia?
2370.
So now, what can you tell me about the W24 by 84? This isn't the section. This isn't good enough, right? Because it doesn't matter that it has enough flexural capacity, it's not stiff enough. It doesn't have a required moment of inertia. Now, what if that was the case? What if instead of 3041, what if it was 2041? Would this be a fine section? Yeah, it would be, right? Because then the moment of inertia would be greater than what we needed. But that's not the case. So now we require a section of 3041. So therefore, what we can say is IX is less than IX required, therefore, W24 by 84 is inadequate. So now what do we do?
Table 3.
There you go. Now let's select the section based on IX. Okay? So what I'll put here is I'll put this table 3.2. What section are we going to select now if we're selecting based off IX? And remember, we're now in another table, right? Table 3.2 is selecting a section based off strain. Table 3.3 is selecting a section based on our moment of inertia requirements. This section is no good. It's not going to work. So now that we see that deflections are going to govern our selection, now let's try a new shape. What section should we be picking now?
W30 by 90.
A 30 by 90, okay? So let's see the 30 by 90, okay? You pick that because it has a moment of inertia of
3,610.
3610 inches to the fourth. Now, maybe what we ought to do before we do any math is ask ourselves, well, what's the VMP? Okay, so we got this from table 3-3. Let's look at the W30 by 90 in table 3-2. What is the VMP for a W30 by 90? In other words, if the VMP is only like 750, well, there's no point in checking this section either because it's not going to have adequate strength. And I'll tell you what we would do in that instance, but let's
1,060.
1,060, 1060. So my question for you is this a worthy section to consider analyzing? Yes, because we know it's got the required moment of inertia. We're probably going to have enough flexural capacity, and if the moment of inertia governs, this is the lightest section that we can find in the manual that has a moment of inertia of at least this or bigger, right? Because that's what the IX table does for us. It sorts by moment of inertia, and it groups based on lightest sections. So the W30 by 90 is probably the biggest section that we can conceivably consider. But the problem is that it is heavier than our assumptions. So if it's heavier than our assumptions, we need to verify the performance. It's heavier than the 50 pounds per foot than we assumed. So the WD, remember the WD was 1.2 kips per foot, and now the self weight is 90 pounds per foot, or 0.09 kips per foot. So we have that. Okay, so now what we would have to do is compute a new VD, and because these calculations are very repetitive, I'm going to do a lot of these for you. I hope that's okay. Let's make sure we're not running out of time. Oh my, we are running short on time. Okay, so I'll be really quick. So VD ends up being WD plus W naught L over 2, which now is 22.58 kips, and MD is WD plus W naught L squared over 8, and this ends up being 197.53 foot kips. So remember, the VL and the ML didn't change. That's still 20 kips and 350 foot kips. So from all of these, VU is 59.1 and MU is now 797. And again, that MU is far greater than that. My advice on this problem is that you should probably verify the live load deflection limit to ensure that it meets that, but it should meet that as well. Ultimately, what I can tell you is that when it's all said and done, you're going to find that this section works, and that what you ultimately need to do is use the W30 by 90. We're running short on time, so I guess I got too wordy in some of my explanations. Real quick, I thought I had my assignment for Monday posted, that Monday that's due Wednesday. It might not be live right at noon, but if you give me like 5 or 10 minutes, I should be able to have that posted. I just didn't get a chance to post it before noon. But if you look and it's not there, give it a few minutes and it'll be there. Does that make sense? All right. You all have an assignment that's due Wednesday. On Wednesday, I have to apologize to you, but we're going to see another differential equation. No,
Great.
that's all I got. I'll see you all on Wednesday.